because the 3D printing process takes a little bit of time, I'm kind of going to do this in reverse order. Last night, I went ahead and printed a very small sample model. I actually used a scaled down copy of one of Mito's models, just because they're cool looking. I hope he doesn't mind that. I was thinking he might actually show up today. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start by excavating one of those models, and then we're going to talk about how to clean up the service station. I'm going to go over excavation, depowdering, and then I think I'm going to go ahead and do a wax dip. And then I'm going to talk about cleaning the service station, and then I'm going to finish up with the first part of the process, which is talking about bringing the model in and getting it set up, and how to do an invoice and stuff like that. So if at any point it becomes clear that we need to move that sucker around, I'm sure we're going to edit some bits out later. Just let me know, okay? And also, I don't mind if you guys interrupt with questions, because if you've got a question while we're doing this, it's clearly something logical that we should be covering right now, right? Excellent. All right. Has anybody been through any part of this process already themselves? A couple of you guys have. Okay. Well, this is what the sucker is going to look like when we're getting started. This whole lid just hinges up right here. The thing is split into two separate stations. This is our actual build area and service station, and this is our depowdering area right here. So what we're going to start by doing, we've got a model in here that's completed. And what I like to do is my student staff has an understanding that they don't mess with the stuff that's up in ZPrinter on this workstation. What I like to do is I like to leave my model or my batch of models up so that we can look at the flyover, because I find that flyover to be a super handy frame of reference for when I'm excavating or supervising excavation. That term is going to make a heck of a lot more sense for those of you who haven't seen it in a couple minutes. Here we've got the window that popped up when this model was done, and this just confirms the name of the job we were doing, approximately how long it took to run. We did a little tiny one. I did a little tiny one as a sample last night. This thing only took, it said 37 minutes and 45 seconds to run. Now here's an important piece of information. Your time estimate, and we'll look more at that in a couple of places, but your time estimate does not factor in, let me know if you can hear me okay, it does not factor in the approximately hour-and-a-half long window where it wants to do a cool down and cure. So if you're trying to figure out how long this batch is actually going to take to run, add about an hour and a half to it. In fact, I rounded up by about 2 hours, because that gives me about a 30-minute window to deal with any cleaning or maintenance or weird model issues, any last-second stuff that I didn't see. We're getting better and better at trimming the time down on that, but I like to pat myself a few minutes just to have some time to deal with it. This thing, as smart as it is, it'll throw you some curves every once in a while. Hopefully we'll talk about some of the most common things. So yeah, it indicates time. It also indicates how much grinder that it uses. Very quickly, since we're doing this, I'm going to talk just basically about what's going on here. Basic process. We have this build tray here. It slices your model up into horizontal sections about 3/1000ths of an inch thick or so, I think. And it'll spread a layer of this loose composite powder here, this super fine powder. It'll spread a layer over, and then it'll actually use just conventional print heads. I will come in and do a close-up on these in a minute. I'm actually going to yank one out just so you can see it. Just uses conventional HP print heads. One color just for impregnating the model with color, and then it uses a monochrome print head that you actually purge the black ink out of, and then it pipes liquid binder from these cartridges right here all the way down in here into the gantry, the printing gantry on this thing, and it actually uses what was the black HP print head as the thing that actually dispenses the liquid binder. So it'll spread a layer of fresh powder, and just like it was printing a page, it'll spit down the binder everywhere it needs to be. It'll rake back, lay another fresh layer of powder over, and drop the whole build tray down by about 3/1000ths of an inch. It'll just repeat that process over and over until your model's done. So when you get ready to excavate, like we're going to be doing in a second, what you're going to do is you're going to remove all the loose powder from around your model until you can actually physically remove it. And then you're going to take it over to this depowdering and recovery station, where we've actually got a teeny tiny little compressed air nozzle, and we'll use a series of fine brushes and get the rest of the powder on. Once you've got your model excavated and depowdered, the last thing that you do is if you're going to put any infiltrant on it, you do your infiltrant. The infiltrant does a couple of things. It makes your model a little bit stronger, and it also makes your color a little more vibrant if you're doing a color model. The most common one that we use and the most inexpensive one is the paraffin wax dipping, which is actually this little oblong white station over here. And we're going to go through that process. I'll talk a little bit about that after we pull the model out. There are several options. Most people do the wax dip because it's fast, cheap, and easy. You can also spray your model with a solution of Epsom salts, and that hardens the outside and makes your colors a little brighter. There's a popular one if you need something stronger. It used to be called Z-Bond. The new formula is actually called Color Bond. But the stuff it's a cyanoacrylic mixture. It's a lot like thinned down super glue, basically, and it just impregnates the outside of your model, makes your color pop a little bit, and makes your exterior a little bit stronger. And in a little while, we'll look at some samples, and I'll show you what they look like, both dipped and undipped, so you can get a sense of what's going on. But basically, until you put some kind of infiltrant on one of these models, they tend to be very fragile, and the colors tend to be a little bit muted. We'll take a look. I'm going to close this thing for now.
Which solution is the hardest?
Come again?
Which solution is the hardest?
Of the ones I mentioned, the Color Bond is the hardest. It's the second most expensive, and it's the second hardest. There's another one that we almost never use. It's called Strength Max, and it's actually a two-part kind of epoxy resin system where you mix a small quantity of it, and it has a working window. It's a little exothermic. It warms up, and you brush that stuff on. It costs the most, it's the hardest to work with, but it also results in the hardest finish. In theory, if you do Strength Max right, you end up with a model you can actually sand and machine and paint and do all kinds of stuff. So it's appealing as far as that's concerned, but it's costly and it's kind of a pain to apply that. We're probably, for today's demonstration, we're probably just going to demonstrate the wax dipping. We can totally do another session where we talk about different infiltrants later. Good question, thank you. I'm going to push my print arm back now. You'll notice, and we'll get to this later when we're cleaning up, every time I roll the arm forward, and it's totally safe on this particular machine for me to do exactly what I'm doing. I can just pull this forward, and you can see it lifts up the cover on what's called the service station. When we get to cleaning this up, I will talk more about the service station. But basically what this does is it helps keep my print heads clean while I'm working. And you'll see how even on a relatively small model like we got here, this thing can get really crudged up. Keeping this sucker clean is one of the most important parts to making sure that this thing runs reliably. First things first, I'm going to take a second and go over excavation. So this, basically where we are in the process now, we're assuming that, we've had whoever come in and do their model. I might actually close one of those doors to reduce the noise. Say again, do we turn off local radio? Actually, if we got one that's not running, sure we can. Unfortunately, most of what you're hearing is just bleed from the air compressor itself. So we'll have to, a lot of ambient noise down here, unfortunately. So if it sounds like I need to speak up or anything like that, give me a holler, okay? Basically, what we're going to do here, we're going to start by removing all of our loose powder on this model. We're assuming, we're starting the process as though you had already done the setup that we're going to cover at the end of this tutorial. This thing's got a console here, an LED console, a very simple control on it. This is kind of a shuttle ring type control. Basically, it's, as it says, push to select, and then when you turn it, you can scroll up and down through your menu choices, and then you just punch to select. In this case, it's very simple. It said it was online, which is what it wants to be anytime you're about to run a print job, but we want to go up to the very first one that says vacuum and depowder, and then select hit. And while the mic probably won't pick it up, if you're standing over here, you can hear, there we go, you can hear the air compressor kick on. So right now, it's basically got something like a shop vac running right now. This hose right here actually has suction in it. And I don't know if you can see the debris trap right here. Again, that's called the debris trap. Anything that we suck up through this hose, whether it's loose powder or anything else, is always going to filter through this debris trap. That's useful for two things. First of all, this thing continually resets recycles and recovers powder. So any crud or bits of models, sadly, that sometimes make it in there are always going to get caught by the trap. Every once in a while, the trap is actually useful for... I'm going to kill that for a second. The trap is actually useful for recovering viable bits of a model if you've got small parts that broke off. But more than anything else, it's there so that you can keep contaminants and stuff like this from getting into your loose powder, because it continually recirculates and recycles that stuff. So I'm actually going to tip out my debris trap right now. And replace that. Take it offline, and then we can vacuum and de-powder. This screen gives me a couple of important pieces of information. It tells me about how much powder I've got in here right now, so that when I get ready to print my next model, I know about how much I have to work with, whether I need to add more. And it also tells me I've got one more control. If I turn this knob, I can actually raise and lower the build tray. I'm going to lower it a little bit. You can see it sinking down there. If I had a lot of models or something really tall, what I do is I gradually raise this thing up as I vacuum the loose powder away. And that's what I'm going to do right now. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this hose right here and start removing some of my loose powder. Now, I made life very simple for myself in this particular case. We can see from our flyover right here, I've just got this one tiny little model right in the middle, and in fact, I can actually see the faintest outline of it right here. And using my screen, I know where I've got loose powder and where my model actually begins. That's what makes the flyover a useful part of the excavation process. I can really go to town and just very quickly clear away my loose powder if I know I'm not going to run into anything. You'll notice I was doing this thing where I let it ride along the side. Anytime I'm getting anywhere close to my model, I like to brace my hose. Because if I don't, what happens if it gets fully engaged with some powder, there's a tendency for it to kind of lurch forward. And if I'm not careful, it'll kind of get pulled out of my hands just a little bit when it gets full of powder, and I can accidentally knock into my model and break pieces off that way. Now in this case, I probably won't need all of the tools that I normally use, but it's important to know I have a little compartment up here on this side of the powdering station that has a series of vacuum tools that I can actually fit onto the end of this thing for various applications, as well as a collection of different brushes that I keep up here. Brushes are going to come in handy after I get my model free. I might, for example, choose to use my prepping tool right here to help me remove some of this stuff. The brush tool looks like it'd be a lot more useful than it really is. There are times when I find it helpful, but for the most part, it's just not quite aggressive enough to do me a whole lot of good. You can see it doesn't really remove a lot there. What I find the brush tool most useful for is when I'm giving this thing a once-over before I walk away from it. If I've got loose powder that's gotten up on the walls, it's great for doing a little housekeeping. But I've never found this one particularly useful for excavation. That's my preference. Your mileage may vary. So I'm going to remove some of the rest of my loose powder here. In this case, because I'm doing such a small model, we can do this really swiftly. When I get to the point where I'm getting close to my actual model, that's when I usually like to take some. And I like this. I like this draftsman brush right here because it allows me to very gently brush powder away. And sometimes the models you're working on are going to be super, super delicate. As you get more and more experience with this, your guys are going to start to get a feel for what likely is going to be readily printable and what is going to be so skinny or delicate. And you can sometimes advise people, you can be like, well, my experience tells me this and this and this are probably going to break off. You can let them know. And, many times they might be like, all right, I'm going to go for it. We'll talk a little bit about some ways they can repair their models if they want to. This one's relatively robust. So again, I'm going to vacuum the rest of my loose powder away. got this tiny little one we're going to do as a sample today. Once I'm able to remove that, get the rest of my powder. This is the part that's going to be difficult to illustrate. Once I've got my model transferred over to my depowdering station, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a combination of brushes, depending on what best allows me to get at it, and this tiny little air compressor right here. We're going to have a hard time seeing it though, because the way you do this, right now, there's actually suction in this hose right here. If I close the lid on this thing, I don't know if you can pick up on the mic the change in noise. This part shut down and the vacuum transferred over to the depowdering station, and the lights in here and the compressor kicked on automatically when I closed the lid. It's smart enough to know when I close the lid, the next thing I'm probably doing is I'm doing final depowdering on my model. What I'm going to do is reach through these brush type areas right here, pick up my air compressor, and dust off my model. Now if I look at the screen right now, it tells me you can adjust the air pressure coming out of this nozzle by twiddling your knob. And because I've got a tiny delicate little nozzle, I'm going to turn this down. If you have your air pressure all the way up and you have a really delicate model, you can actually blast pieces right off of it. Stick this back to the cradle. Kind of one-arm this for a second so you can see what we're doing. And depending on how large and how elaborate the person's model is, they might be a long time doing this process. I picked one where we could get through it quickly, just so I can show you what's going on. But once you've got this thing brushed off and depowdered to your satisfaction, exit out of that. Thank you, Alex. And then you got, I'm going to bring this up a little bit closer. You got your finished model, and you can see this has got all of these holes and concavities in it. And you can see I've removed all of the loose powder that was in there. Again, just for the record, this is Mito's model. I just stole a copy of it for demo purposes. I hope he's flattered by that. And you can see, if you look really closely, some of these areas right here, if I went back in there and I applied a little more air pressure, I could clear the last of that loose powder out of there. There's another one right by my fingernail, that white spot right there. If I get in there with a fine brush or a little air, I can get that out of there. In fact, I'm going to take just a second and see if I can do that just to illustrate it. Because that's something that for some people, for some applications, getting it completely cleaned out is going to be important. Others will care less. So I'm going to fire this up one more time. This is the posture you're more likely to see me in. In this case, my demo model is so small, I just pulled it out through the arm hole. So you can see I've actually exposed a little bit more of its purple there where I cleaned those away. You can see how I blew the last of those little pockets of dust out of there. You can get it to the point where powder's not coming off in your hands, but it's still got stuff in the little nooks and crannies. And you can see how this is kind of a light blue right now. All the colors are fairly light right now. The next thing we're going to do with this, after, you'll walk a person through that basic process of excavation saying, here's your vacuum, here's how you use your vacuum, here are your brushes and your powder. When it's as clean as you need it to be, next thing you do is you can either, if you don't want to do an infiltration on it, you can just take it away, but, beware that it's going to be quite fragile like this. I'm having to handle this gently. Or you'll do your infiltrate. We'll talk about that when we do the invoicing. But I'm going to wax stiff this thing. I'm going to go ahead and show you that process. And the wax stiffing process is actually very simple. Just arrange whatever pieces you want in here. I'm just going to lay this guy in the middle of my tray. there's a little bit of stuff to consider as far as orientation of your model. Like if your model's like bowl shaped, or if it's got big holes or caves in it anywhere, bear in mind what you're basically going to do is you're going to submerge that sucker in a vat of liquid paraffin. So if it's got things where there's going to be like a big air bubble that's going to make it want to lift up or anything like that, you might want to think a little bit about how you want to orient it so that the wax flows in there properly. For a lot of models, it's a total non-issue. But every once in a while, you'll have unique geometry where if you've got something dish-shaped or with a big hollow in it, you want to turn it to where the wax can flow in and out. So that's something to think about. Every once in a while, somebody will have a model where the geometry is such that it wants to float up to the top if you don't turn it right. Most of the time, it's not a big deal, though. But once you've got your model or models in there, you can do more than one model if you want to, but I always like to make sure I leave plenty of space. This couldn't be simpler. You just hit cycle start. I don't know if you can make it out, but it says preheat, and there's a 5-minute timer. It's going to sit there for 5 minutes while the air and the wax get back up to proper temperature, and just make sure it's at the ideal temperature for dipping. So there's a 5-minute countdown, and then it takes about a minute and a half for it to submerge down, and it spends a few seconds in the wax, and then it comes back up, and then it spends 5 minutes draining off the excess paraffin and cooling off. So call it like a 10 or 12 minute cycle total. I've started it here. It's going to beep pretty loudly in a minute. We're going to be talking about other things at the time, but it's going to beep at us quite audibly and let us know that it's starting the wax soak. And then it's going to beep again 5 minutes later and let us know that it's done and we can take it out. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about cleaning up this thing and starting to talk about maintenance. And I'll just take a break from that in about 10 or 12 minutes. Hopefully I'll be getting close to done. And then we'll take a look at our finished model. Going back to this thing right here, forgive me, I've got a little bit of a sniffle right now. Going back to our station, this is about what it's probably going to look like, this or messier, after you finish pulling everybody's models out. There's going to be loose powder scattered all over the place. So the very first thing I like to do, I'm going to start my vacuum. I like to make sure I have all of my loose powder pulled up. And it's worth mentioning, and you may have to get all over the place to get all this, or we may have to do some extra shots, that in addition to the powder here in the build tray, there is always some spillage over on the sides. So you want to pull that up. As much as you readily can. And again, we've got the debris trap, so don't worry about sucking up some loose pieces and things like that, because we'll just tip those out of the debris trap when we're done. And this little area in between the build tray and this box right here, which is called the service station, this tends to collect not only powder, but a little bit of like liquid binder. So you get, this is one of the areas that you first notice tends to get gunked up a lot. I'm going to kill my vacuum for a second. Once I've gotten the bulk of my loose powder up, then I'm going to get to work in earnest actually cleaning this thing up. And I'm going to need a couple of tools to help me out with that. So I'm going to need several, but there are two important ones that I keep here. We have this little silver brush right here. It has very short, very stiff bristles, and it has one particular job that it's really well suited for, and that's for helping me clean out the grid on the debris trap. And then I have just a regular old steel pick, just a 90-degree pick right here. And this thing is incredibly useful for helping me get some of the crud out of there. There are two other things I'm going to use a lot of, but they're disposable. One is just regular old cotton swabs. We're going to go through a mess of cotton swabs cleaning up the service station. And the other are these little alcohol crush swabs. I always have a hard time opening this particular kind of package. They're not really well designed to open with fingernails, so I actually just use my pick to help pierce this so that I can get in there. But you've just got a a little vial right here with glass in it, and if you just crush that, it allows a quantity of isopropyl alcohol to flow into this little filter in the front. And you basically got a little single-use alcohol scrub brush, which is absolutely invaluable for doing things like cleaning your print heads, which is one of the very first things you're going to do. I'm going to pull the arm forward here, and then you see this notch right here? If you slide, and again, moving this manually is totally fine when it's offline. You slide your whole print head assembly so that it lines up with this notch right here, and it's got a latch you push forward, and then you can open up this cover, and that exposes both your print heads. Now, I just ran a teeny tiny little job last night, so these aren't nearly as filthy as they could be. When I've been doing a big job where it's done like 8 inches of printing, this thing is a gooey, sticky mess. But it's going to be relatively quick and simple to clean up today. So I'm going to take my alcohol crush log, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that the surface of my print heads, both my color and my black one, are clean.
Can you bring that up close to this?
I sure can.
Yeah. I'm just going to clean the surface of this thing. If it had been seeing heavy usage, you'd see like this sort of pasty mixture of binder and powder kind of accumulated around it, usually impregnated with a little bit of ink as well. It's a big sticky mess, and when we start cleaning the service station, you'll see more of that. Same thing with the color. Again, because I ran such a little job, it's a lot cleaner than it sometimes will be. Here's one where I'm afraid you may have to change the angle to get a really good look at it. As we get into the part where we're cleaning the service station, it might actually be worth your while to move the camera just a little bit closer. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little inspection mirror. Oops. This little inspection mirror that has a strip of magnetic tape on the back and normally lives right up there on the inside of the depowdering unit. And I'm going to use this to look underneath my printhead assembly. And I don't know if you can see or not, there's all this nasty white stuff accumulated on the underside of the print carriage. That stuff can be a real pain to get to, which is why the mirror is there. I'm going to use my wash bottle. I got a couple of wash bottles here that I keep filled with distilled water. It's important that you use distilled water, not tap, because the mineral deposits can mess up some of the stuff that are in here. I actually keep a jug of the stuff down here by the station, and I've got it labeled 3D printer. And if we ever get low on this, and we'll talk about expendables, anytime we get low on any expendables, give me a holler to make sure that I replace it in time. Especially since, folks, to be honest, sometimes we have a hard time getting the company to keep up with demand. So the earlier you can let me know that we're running low on something, the less likely we are to get caught with our pants down. Fortunately, distilled water ain't that hard to come by. But I keep a couple of these wash bottles filled up with it. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reach under here and try and get the worst of the gunk off of the underside of this thing. This part that I'm showing you right here, there are 3 basic areas you want to make sure you clean when you turn this thing around. Otherwise, the dirt and the buildup on there is going to start to screw up your model quality. There are 3 areas. This is, in my opinion, by far the hardest one to keep clean and the hardest one to reach, but it's also super important to remember because if the area around your print head starts to get gunked up with stuff, every single layer that it makes is going to have problems in it. I'm going to do what I can to make sure I've got all of the built-up powder and binder and ink removed from this thing. And you can see there's all sorts of nastiness coming off on these Q-tips. And again, this is just a small job. I'm not gonna lie to you, cleaning the service station and the print heads is gonna be your least favorite job. But it is super, super critical because this thing will just be toast if we don't do it. There we go. Nasty little bits like this little crumb right here. If I smear this between my fingers, what I expect to see, yeah, I got little sort of like 3D printer boogers right here that are a combination of liquid binder and loose powder and color that has bled out of the ink cartridges. And if that stuff gets mixed in with my powder, it's just going to make a nasty mess. I'm actually going to bring my wastebasket close by. If I were doing this for real, I'm gonna do a kind of a cursory job of this now so that we don't spend an hour and a half watching me in there with Q-tips. But I want to make sure that I clearly illustrate what we're doing here at every step of the way. So the first thing we're going to want to do is make sure that we've got as much cleaned out of the area around these print cartridges as we possibly can. And if we see any ink that's been spilling, because there will always be a little bit of a mist of ink that builds up on these things just from the process. Yeah. If I just swab the insides of this thing, you can see I'm picking up a little bit of color right there. So the cleaner we keep that, the better off we're going to be. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this station. Everywhere I can see build up powder, everywhere I can see build up ink. And don't be afraid to go through the Q-tips. I also like to have a few paper towels handy, and I'll show you some of the places where we use those momentarily. But after I get this station cleaned up as best I can, the next area that I'm going to get, put that down for a second, is my service station, this one right here. Now, there's this little crevice right here that I was talking about that tends to be an area that where we not only collect loose powder, but where we kind of get a mixture of powder and binder. This is one of the areas that gets really gross when we do a big job. And it is sometimes necessary to pick out some of the extra that builds up. And after you do this a few times, you might really get your routine down. But I can easily spend a chunk of time just cleaning up the area around my service center, my service station. Don't let me forget. One of the things that I want to make sure we get. Oh, you can see it's coming off the chunks there. This is just after a single printing. One of the things I want to make sure we talk about for at least a minute before we finish up today is how surprisingly useful the help files on the ZPrint software are. Amazingly, they've actually got some pretty robust and helpful and well-illustrated help files. So one of the cool things is that if you're ever stuck, if you're ever unclear on some of this stuff, you can oftentimes find actually fairly helpful answers about what to do just by looking it up in the help file. And we will talk about that in a little bit. We've got this little sort of rectangular reservoir right here. And right now this thing is just full of leftover ink. I'm going to swab a little bit of that stuff out of there. Basically what's going on with the service station, we've got our print head assembly over here. After every single pass, when it spreads a new layer and puts its binder down, your service station is going to come over here and it's going to go over this reservoir, which actually gets filled with a special cleaning solution. And it's got this little wick right here that wicks that cleaning solution up and basically squeegees off and cleans the underside of the print heads after every single pass. That's what's going on with this little box right here, which is why it gets so filthy after a job. So when I'm turning this thing around and I'm getting it ready to go again, I always like to get as much of the crud out of here as I possibly can. Yeah, it gets all over you. Some people like to wear nitrile gloves to keep their hands clean. There's a special kind of purple nitrile glove we keep in there for working with some of our infiltrants. That's actually, I like to save that for working with stuff like Color Bond and Strength Max. We can use the standard like blue nitrile gloves that I keep out in my shop, and I'll show you guys that. That's if you feel like wearing gloves to keep the stuff off your hands. It'll wash though. I do want to show you this little red cap right here. This red cap covers up the wash fluid reservoir on the inside of your service station. And I like to keep that thing about half full. You don't want to fill it all the way up to the top or it'll actually leak out a little bit. You want to keep it about half full. You can just eyeball that. If you ever look in here and you see that your wash fluid is like bone dry in there, I try to keep in here, in this same little compartment, at least a couple bottles of the wash fluid. Cleaning solution, they call it. Cleaning solution. In these little bottles, I think these are like 2 ounce, 3 ounce bottles. And I'm going to add just a tiny bit right now. And you can see the stuff is slightly viscous. Put that away. And then replace my cap. Yeah, that's actually, there's a little wick that goes down in here. It is possible to remove the entire top half of this thing if you want to. Sometimes I like to do that just because it makes it easier for me to get the stuff in here. But if I'm just doing a quick cleaning, I'm going to take my my wash bottle full of distilled water. This thing actually has a drain in the bottom of it, so that you can sluice a bunch of water down in here to clean this up. This thing has a drain that actually pipes down to an evaporative waste tray down in the guts of the machine. So when I'm cleaning this up, you'll see me do stuff like this. You'll see me just blast away at this thing as I'm washing all the gunk out of the inside of this thing. Totally cool to do that. You don't want to spray water anywhere else in this machine, but in this part, it is totally fine to get this thing wet. Now I just heard, you can probably pick that up on mic, I just heard the wax dipper beep. I believe that just indicates that it's starting the dip process, right? Or is it finished already? It's already done?
Yeah, yeah.
Excellent. And it's into its 5-minute post heat, right?
It just says ready right now.
Huh.
I saw it come back up a while ago.
Oh, okay. But while I was talking, it actually completed its entire cycle. Wonderful. In that case, I'm going to take a break from the service station for a second, and we're going to go over there and look at that wax dip process and see what's going on. All right. Yeah, sure enough, it's completed its cycle. 5 minutes down, 5 minutes up. And this is again my preference, I always like to have a little piece of paper towel where I can transfer my model and let it just sit, and as you can see, I can blot up a little bit of paraffin right there. And you can see already, the color is already a lot more vibrant on this thing than it was. It really improves the color quality a lot when you put an infiltrant in there. And also, after the paraffin hardens, it's going to make this thing a lot less fragile. I'm actually going to manually blot off a little bit, and I'm just going to leave that to sit there and cool. Now I make that look super easy because it's such a small, easy to manipulate model. You can see where somebody was attempting to print something a little bit more delicate here, and they ran into problems. I frequently see people try to print really delicate geometry like this, and you can see, since this one's already toast, I'm going to do it, you can see how fragile. I barely had to put any pressure on that at all. When you've got really skinny, delicate members like this, it is not hard to break those. If you excavate them very, very carefully, you can do delicate things like that, but boy, if you're doing a model like that, just know if you've got skinny members like that, it's really easy to break them. So, just want to point that out. All right, I'm going to let that finished model cool off, and we'll come back and look at some more of those commitments. I'm going to go back to cleaning up my service station. Now, we've got these little rubber blades right here. I'm going to give you a second to get in there. I shouldn't be coming back to this half a thing, so if you need to move in closer, you can. when this thing's been doing a big job, these blades, these little rubber blades right here, will get really crudded up. And so it's very important to make sure that we've wiped any excess powder and binder off of them. So we'll get these as clean as we can. And if you see places where you've got that sort of pasty mixture of powder and binder, which I am in the corners of all of these things right now, you can pick that stuff loose. I'll keep this thing from getting completely obstructed. You've got this little drain right here in the corner that actually pipes down to an area inside the machine.